Would you believe that this guy was accused of attempted murder twice? I know it's kinda hard to believe. The guy who sang some of the most tender ballads of all time.
Who's gonna give their heart and soul to get to me?
Who used a whole can of hairspray to poof up his hair. Nope, doesn't seem like a killer. But George Jones was a complicated man, or a complicated possum. George had quite the resume. Over the years, he served in the military, went to jail, attempted murder twice, was institutionalized, and became a legend in country music. And these are just the stories we know. But there was another side to this man, one that was tender, sensitive, and kind. So who was the real George Jones? What made him kinda go crazy? What stunning remarks did he make about Carrie Underwood and Taylor Swift? What were his final words? And most importantly, why did he quit music? Today we'll find out, but before we dive in, please hit that thumbs up icon to show your support. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a new video. But now, buckle up, because the race is on as we go find out.
What happened?
What did George Jones do in the Marines? Some musicians are famous for their military service. Elvis, Johnny Cash, their time in uniform is part of their legends. But a lesser-known serviceman was George. So what did he do in the Marines, and what's the shocking reason why he joined? Years before anybody had heard of Tammy Wynette, George Jones married a young woman named Dorothy Bonvillian. George was an aspiring country musician and a super fan of Hank Williams. But Hank was a star, and George was a nobody, besides a few radio spots. But although George was only 18, he was already dealing with the problem that would plague his entire life: alcohol. He was an absolute terror to his poor wife, and she filed for divorce within a year, even though she was 6 months pregnant with his child. George lost his wife, and in exchange, he gained a big old child support bill. Now, musicians are known for a lot of things, but financial stability maybe isn't one. As far as lucrative careers go, it's up there with piggy bank robber and professional TV watcher. So he failed to pay up and was thrown in jail twice. So to make enough dough, George tried a classic strategy for a young man in a tough spot. He joined the military. Fortunately, he was lucky enough that he didn't have to go to war or even overseas. Lucky because a helmet would probably have messed up his nice poofy hair. There was another upside too. George was able to play music on the weekends. He even made extra cash that way, and more importantly, he was able to develop a career. And when he got out of the service, he was determined to make it big time. And make it he did. Did George Jones try to kill Tammy Wynette? George's drunken binges are the stuff of legend. Everybody knows about that time he drove a lawnmower to the liquor store. But it wasn't always wacky escapades. Jones could get angry and scary. But did his rage really rise to the level of attempted murder? Okay, so when George married Tammy Wynette, it was something like out of a fairy tale. But their marriage ended up being less of a dream and more of a nightmare. And who took most of his rage? Well, the person closest to him, of course, Tammy. One night, Tammy claimed he came home drunk and chased her through the house with a loaded rifle. He didn't shoot her, but he did shoot up the house, she claimed. Years later, George would claim that Tammy made that whole thing up. And he would have some credibility. Tammy's own daughters claimed that Tammy once faked being kidnapped to cover up a lie. But what we do know is this: the king and queen of country music split. The kingdom no more. And terribly, losing Tammy would push George further into addiction. But more than just addiction, he would lose his mind. Did George go crazy? After the divorce, George's life became one long bender, and not a fun one like The Hangover.
Put some pants on, you have weird legs.
Yes, Daddy.
No, it was more like leaving Las Vegas.
What
What's your name?
So, did George really develop a multiple personality disorder? And what role did Tammy play in all of this? So after the split, George stopped playing music for a bit, but his friends encouraged him to start singing again as soon as possible, even with Tammy. Even as their marriage collapsed, their chemistry on stage still was dynamite. So he started recording and performing with her again. Making music was always good for George. What wasn't good was having to see Tammy fawning over other guys. And yeah, there were a lot of other guys. Among those that Tammy dated were the driver of her tour bus, the bassist in her band, and Burt Reynolds. Yeah, one of these things is not like the other, and it's that sexy mustached Burt. She even sat on Ronald Reagan's lap one time while performing Stand By Your Man. And the two could not stop recording together, they were just too good. One notable song is the classic Golden Rings, which follows the arc of a doomed marriage from beginning to end. It was, of course, a true story. And so, as you can imagine, all of this was incredibly painful for George. Hey, I'm sure it was for Tammy too, but we're talking about George. So painful that it drove him crazy, he developed his own form of multiple personality disorder. Apparently, he had two different people living inside of his head, and to his credit, he was a hospitable host. He gave these characters names: the Duck and the Old Man. The Duck, a kind of knockoff Donald Duck impression, came first. The Old Man came later, because the Duck needed somebody to talk to. Often they would begin to fight, and George would step in and break it up. One time, George was on the tour bus when he announced he was kicking the Duck off the bus. But later, he felt so guilty about that he made the driver turn around and pick the Duck back up. Then things somehow got even worse. George's best friend found Jesus, turned his life around and stopped drinking and gambling. So George was distraught and felt like his friend was abandoning him. So he told him to meet him down by the creek and then shot at him. He would have gotten 15 years for attempted murder had his friend not dropped the charges. Then, even the Duck and the Old Man left. While George still had many people that loved him, it didn't feel like it, and it would take more than just rehab to save him. What saved George Jones? There's a commonly accepted story about what saved George. It has all the traits of a typical Hollywood affair, and it's not exactly wrong per se. But there is another account for what saved the King of Country, and that's a bit more complicated. In 1980, George hadn't had a #1 hit in 6 years. His producer brought him a song that he thought was a surefire hit. George, however, hated it, saying it was too slow, too long, too sad. But he finally convinced him to give it a shot, and that song was called He Stopped Loving Her Today.
He stopped loving her today.
George was in such bad shape, slurring his words so much that it took 18 months to record that track. When he finally settled down in that booth, the first take was horrible. But then, Tammy and her new husband, George Ritchie, stopped by the studio. George went in and delivered a stunning second take, which would end up being the final one. The song was a smash hit, of course, and a classic. It became George's signature song. Honestly, it has brought joy to so many people around the world that it gave George the will to keep on trying. Of course, he didn't get fully sober until many years later. That's when he met his last wife, Nancy, who would get him to turn his life around. But the song had a huge effect on George's life, even though he had lost Tammy, his best friend, the Duck, and the Old Man. George still had his gift, his beautiful voice, and the power to touch the soul of anybody with a radio. What did George say about Carrie Underwood and Taylor Swift? To many, George Jones represents a bygone era, a world that no longer exists. So what did he think about the new Nashville? Well, in his later years, George was asked about the next generation of country musicians. You know, singers like Taylor Swift, Carrie Underwood that made shinier, poppier tunes. George said that his favorite performers were guys like Alan Jackson and George Strait, guys that were playing more traditional country music. And regarding those singers like Carrie Underwood, he said, quote, "They had to use something that was established already, and that's traditional country music. So what they need to do really, I think, is find their own title, because they're definitely not traditional country music." What were George's final words? George Jones passed away in 2013. His years of binging finally caught up to him. But now his widow, the woman who saved him, is coming clean about his final words. George's final wife, Nancy, once said that God put her with him so she could help get the devil out of him. But it wasn't exactly an easy task. It took 18 years for the Possum to finally get clean. Nancy always credited her faith as motivating George to get clean and motivating her to stay with him. By 2013, George was very sick. He'd been quiet for a few days, and it seemed like he was on his way out. Nancy was sitting with him, waiting for him to fade into the darkness. But all of a sudden, he said very clearly, "Well, hello there. I've been looking for you. My name's George Jones." Nancy said, quote, "He was talking to God. I know in my heart he was talking to God, and he has gone to heaven." Those were George's final words as the king of country music passed away. Staying true to his oddball personality, he was buried with a flashlight and nail clippers. Alright, that's enough of me. Now we need to hear from you. Do you believe Tammy when she says that George chased her with a shotgun? What do you think about his statement about new country music? Is it too poppy? Is it not traditional enough? Finally, get in the comments and tell me your favorite George Jones song. If you enjoyed the video today, please give it a thumbs up, it's not so hard. Subscribe to the channel and come back often, so we can keep telling you